Okay, good evening. It is 5 o'clock. Welcome to episode 2 of Kojo's Corner, where we are at the intersection of people, politics, power, and participation. Um, on today's episode, we have Victoria Bomberry, who is part of Chill and is going to be talking to us about the 2030 Indigenous Community Vision for Hamilton. So, Victoria, can you introduce us to you? Tell
Yeah.
us your role at Chill and a summary of what Chill does. I don't think many people might know what Chill does. And by the way, Chill is the coalition of Hamilton Indigenous Leadership, formerly the Hamilton Executive Directors Aboriginal Coalition. So, Victoria, an introduction and what Chill does, and then we'll get into the community vision.
Sego Kojo, thank you for inviting me to sit with you and share about Chill and the Indigenous Community Vision. So Sego Silaguego, my name is Victoria Bomberry. Ganyagahagani Wakonjoda, Waxkrewa Ginimagitaroda, Six Nations Nidawagenu, Dana Tonue ne Ungohue ne Wagadahiara, Dana Dokranio Sarage, Ganto ne Ganadago ne Ohlumago Jogini Daron Dakwe, Dokaranio Sarage, Gina Henexise, Ganto Ganadago Wagyote. So I'm a Mohawk Bear from Six Nations of the Grand River. I grew up over on Six, but I lived in Hamilton for a number of years and was very fortunate to connect with the Indigenous community up here. And even though my son and I have moved back to Six Nations, I still work for the Indigenous community of Hamilton through CHIL, the Coalition of Hamilton Indigenous Leadership. And as Kojo mentioned, CHIL was formerly known as the Hamilton Executive Directors Aboriginal Coalition. Chill/slash Headache has been around for over 20 years. Headache was established in 1999, and I think that speaks to the commitment the Indigenous community leadership has had in terms of supporting community-wide initiatives. So Chill is an umbrella organization. We are for Indigenous, by Indigenous. Our executive director, Cindy Sue Montana McCormick, lived in Hamilton throughout her entire life, and she's worked for the Indigenous community of Hamilton for decades as well. And so we're led by wonderful leaders. Chill is a coalition made up of 6 Indigenous agencies in Hamilton, the Aboriginal Health Center. Our member agencies are the Health Center, the Hamilton Regional Indian Center, Sacagawea Nonprofit Housing, Ontario Aboriginal Housing Services, the Native Women's Center, and NEPAM Youth Employment Services. What we do, we don't provide services. So that tends to be the main reason people are not familiar with Chill. We're kind of in the background doing policy and data work. My role specifically is the Indigenous Data and Policy Analyst for Chill. And so what we do is Chill receives government funding, federal, municipal, and provincial, and we work collectively to distribute that to Indigenous agencies in Hamilton so that we work together, recognizing our strengths. We work on a consensus decision making model so that we all come together, the executive directors from each of our member agencies, bring their expertise to the table, and collectively decide how best to distribute funds into the community.
So, um, thank you for giving us that summary or history of Chill. If folks don't know, please, this is your opportunity to know. And the website is www chill leadership, and it's CHI
Yeah.
and leadership .com. So not chill and leadership, but CHI leadership dot com. So let's dive into the 2030 Indigenous Community Vision for Hamilton. What Why did it start? Where did it start? What is the purpose, and how is it being shared with the indigenous community and um folks that are now living in what we call Hamilton?
Yeah. The Indigenous Community Vision for Hamilton was an initiative Chill took on in 2022. We engage with community quite regularly through conversations, through sessions, workshops where we talk to people about specific issues and how what their priorities are, specifically around homelessness and housing. That's our main portfolio, and one of the common themes that came up in a lot of our conversations across the years is how Indigenous community members don't feel that they're represented in the city of Hamilton in terms of the vision of Hamilton, leadership, and what the city's priorities are in terms of what needs to be where investment should be. So we're reflecting on, we're hearing this from our community members across years and throughout conversations, and what can we do? And we decided that we wanted to focus our conversations throughout 2022 to ask Indigenous community members, thinking about 8 years from now in 2030, what would Indigenous peoples need in the city of Hamilton to thrive? And that was our core question to Indigenous peoples. We hosted over 20 conversations, population specific Indigenous families, Indigenous women, Indigenous youth, 2S LGBTQ, Indigenous seniors, and asked over and over again, what do we need in the city to thrive in terms of education, in terms of employment, in terms of culture, in terms of health and justice. And so we engaged over 300 community members, both online and in person, through small conversations and as well as participating in big events like the Soaring Spirit Festival, which is Hamilton's National Indigenous Peoples Day celebration. Um, and so that's how this vision came to be, weaving all those voices that we heard across 2022 and the themes that emerged from those conversations is where it came from. And the purpose, we also, as Indigenous leaders, I sit on quite a few tables at the municipal level, at the government level, the national and federal level. And I think you, Kojo, would be familiar. Like reconciliation is a word that's thrown around quite liberally in different ways, and it's not really well defined. And so when we see groups or organizations coming forward asking us for land acknowledgements, that's not what Chill's here for. We're not here to provide land acknowledgements for individual agencies or organizations. We're here to support our agencies to do the work that they need to do to support Indigenous peoples. And so we're hearing this from community through our own experiences, requests from different agencies and individuals, and what we're seeing at the policy level. The Indigenous community vision was a way to, say this is, there's some really great work happening out there in terms of reconciliation, but then there's also these things that are being put out there as reconciliation that isn't necessarily meeting the needs as to what the Indigenous community is calling for. And so the Indigenous community vision is kind of honing in on that and saying, if you're putting a land acknowledgement out there, which is great, it's a great first step, but that's not the end of it. That's the start of what Indigenous peoples have been asking for, acknowledging that our territories, our traditional territories, but then acknowledging the needs and the histories and the violence that's gone on in our territories, the way that non-Indigenous peoples have benefited from that violence. And the vision is asking for non-Indigenous individuals, institutions, organizations to reflect on that and look at the ways that they can redress that violence and redress the way that Indigenous peoples have been disempowered and dispossessed in very violent manners, and contribute to reconciliation and the way that we can uplift Indigenous peoples and create a more mutual relationship between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples. And so that's the big vision of the vision.
Hmm. And I let me say yes. We There are lots of folks that do the land
The-
acknowledgement, and it's like done. All right, back
yes,
to the regular schedule of settler colonization. So um, I there's the one of the key things that I mentioned in the community vision is reconciliation through reclamation.
yes.
So um can you tell us what that means and how the reclamation is done in the various disciplines or the various sectors that you highlight in the vision.
Yeah, I think I want to take a step back, Kojo, because I think maybe I'm assuming people are really familiar with what we mean by reconciliation and are not familiar with the Truth and Reconciliation, Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and why we're seeking reconciliation. So Canada has a well documented history of um, intentional policies that have disempowered and dispossessed and displaced Indigenous peoples. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was born from Canada's residential school system, recognizing that Canada's residential school system very intentionally stole Indigenous children from their families, from their communities, and took them into these institutions where they were told that being Indigenous was not a good thing to be, that speaking your language was prohibited. Expressing your indigenous knowledge was frowned upon. You know, it was a very traumatic and violent place to be, where many indigenous children, babies and children, died in those institutions, and those that survived were severely traumatized and often went on to have a number of issues throughout their lives. And so the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was telling that truth. You know, Indigenous peoples are not disproportionately experiencing homelessness just because. Indigenous peoples are disproportionately experiencing homelessness in Canada because of many of these intentional policies. Canada's residential school system, the millennial scoop that continues to take Indigenous children at a disproportionate rate from their families and put them into foster care, the education system that continues to disproportionately underfund Indigenous schools on reserve, where I went to school and where my son currently goes to school on reserve. You know, these policies have intentionally disempowered Indigenous peoples and took us from our homelands, took us from our families, communities, violently dispossessed us of our language and traditional knowledges, and impoverished Indigenous peoples to the benefit of Canadians. And so reconciliation is first truth, recognizing these truths, that these policies, historical and ongoing policies of Canada, have caused what we see today, where Indigenous peoples are disproportionately impoverished, experiencing homelessness, etc. Um, and that reconciliation is looking at those policies and intentionally redressing them, looking at the ways that we can invest in Indigenous peoples and Indigenous places to support them in the way that Indigenous peoples say that they want to be supported. And so reconciliation is that, looking at the relationship between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples. And so I wanted to bring that kind of background to this conversation in case people are kind of not familiar with what reconciliation is stemming from, and why Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples are bringing these conversations forward about reconciliation.
Mhm. So then, having exposed the truth or made the truth uh, risen for all to see, or to for it to be known, how then does that tie into reconciliation through reclamation?
Yeah, so it's an ongoing work. Like, there's still truths that we don't know about the way Indigenous peoples have been oppressed on these lands. It's recognizing that Indigenous ways of knowing and being, Indigenous justice systems, Indigenous knowledges are valid and they deserve. Indigenous nations, First Nations, Métis and Inuit people have autonomy that is inherent, and it's not appropriate for Canada to dictate how we can express our nationhood. Reconciliation through reclamation is just that, recognizing that Indigenous peoples have been, since Canadian Canada was established, have been asserting their identity, asserting their autonomy, And the Indigenous Community Vision is calling for reconciliation through reclamation by ensuring that the City of Hamilton, individuals and institutions invest in the ways that Indigenous peoples want to be supported. And what we heard throughout every conversation in this initiative was that Indigenous peoples want more access to our traditional knowledges, want more access to culture, learning opportunities to learn more about their identity and their traditional ways of being. Um, and that comes, not only in cultural sessions, at the Hamilton Regional Indian Center, but that's also when we go to the hospital that they don't feel safe accessing healthcare in Hamilton's hospital system, and that we should have access to traditional ways of healing in Hamilton's healthcare system, but we don't.
Hmm. So I want to read one of the statements, and then we can get into the reclamation. So it says, reclamation of land, culture, and community must be prioritized for indigenous peoples to heal from the legacies of colonization and thrive in Hamilton. So let's start with land. I think this, and correct me if I'm wrong, that this is what we're here for. Like, I would say land is the foundational piece of how people be,
Yeah.
right? So when we are talking about reclamation of land, what what's the 2030 vision in this report when we are talking about reclamation of land?
Yeah, so the Indigenous Community Vision sets forth some examples as to what that can look like. And those examples are based on the conversations and what we heard from Indigenous community members and what we've experienced as Indigenous leaders. One example we're experiencing right now is the Soaring Spirit Festival, the National Indigenous Peoples Day celebration in Hamilton. I've been involved in Soaring Spirit Festival um, for 3 years now. Obviously, they took a break during COVID. And for each of those 3 years, the organizing committee agency had to seek out different spots in the city to host that festival and powwow because Hamilton doesn't have space that's designated for Indigenous peoples to use to engage in celebrations or to engage in ceremonies or to engage, just simply being as we want to be in nature and on the land. And that's a prime example, right? Having designated space where Indigenous peoples can go to perform our ceremonies or to do cultural practices without having to run through, different municipal application processes to feel that we're safe to engage in our ceremonies on that land. And so that is an example of reclamation of land in the city that the Indigenous community has identified. We want land to simply do our ceremonies, and that's not possible yet.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the recommendations in the Hamilton Urban Indigenous Strategy, right? And it's one of the things that I find frustrating is that, you know, these things are have been said before,
Yes,
but
yes,
but nobody seems to be um to be making a move towards it. One of the ideas that are floated, and again, I'm just a normal resident of Hamilton. I ain't got no power to move anything. But one of the things that I have floated is we have the Pier 8 Bayfront Trust, right? It hasn't been used. Nobody knows what's going on with that land. Hamilton has polluted the water
yeah,
when indigenous women were saying there's something wrong with the water. They were vilified. Nobody listened to them. So I would say that's one of the places that we could start with land reclamation.
yeah.
Am I wrong?
No, coach, I think you're one, not an ordinary citizen. You're very community engaged and aware of a lot of the issues many of our communities are facing. And that's what the Indigenous Community Division wants to spark. You know, we want to stimulate these conversations because Indigenous community members have been saying this for quite a long time. We need land to perform our ceremonies. We need land where we can gather and celebrate. And, you know, the vision is hope is the purpose of the vision. One of the purposes is to stimulate that conversation, to get individuals and institutions thinking, you know, hey, here's um, a clear example of what Indigenous peoples are calling for in terms of reconciliation, and that's land reclamation. Where do we have land in the city that is being underutilized or unutilized that Indigenous peoples could benefit from?
Can I add something? And I would even say that it's not where land is underutilized. It's it's the reciprocal responsibility,
Yes.
right? Because if if Hamilton residents are benefiting from a process of colonization that has marginalized, excluded, vilified,
Mm-hmm.
exploited, uh, uh, I mean, the list goes on, then it's a responsibility to ensure that indigenous communities have any and everything that they need, right? So that would be an addition an addition and a responsibility. So um that's the piece on land. Let's move to culture. What does reclamation of culture look like for the 2030 community vision?
Yeah, one of the examples that we heard in our conversations through the Indigenous community vision work that we are engaged in, and that we've heard for years, is the need for an Indigenous cultural center in Hamilton, a place, you know, that is offering opportunities to learn our traditional languages, to learn about our traditional foods, to learn about our traditional relationships and responsibilities to each other, that Indigenous peoples um, can share and celebrate our traditional knowledges and ways of being, but also relearn them. As I mentioned, you know, there's been a number of Canadian policies that have disconnected Indigenous families and disconnected Indigenous peoples from our traditional knowledges, and that reclamation of culture is um, fundamental to who we are and fundamental to our well-being, and that this is, you know, not something that should be added on to, you know, once in a while, but the community has consistently said over years we need a cultural center where we can gather and relearn and celebrate our ways of being and ways of knowing. That is one example of it. You know, there's many ways that
Hmm.
that could be provided.
Yeah. Hmm. And you know, I read the vision, and I'm also concerned that when everybody knows that the treatment of Canada with respect to indigenous communities, nations, and peoples is cultural genocide, then what exactly are all levels of government doing?
Yeah.
I get that our municipality has an urban indigenous department. I hear they are hiring more people. They are hiring more people. Um, our provincial government doesn't doesn't take seriously the issues a federal government that um, has even taken indigenous communities to court, right? So, uh, what will it take? I know the vision is there, but what will it take for all of us to break through to ensure that we are actually embodying the reconciliation through reclamation, particularly as it relates to culture?
You know, um, first I want to say the Urban Indigenous Strategy Shelley Hill's team is we work we really appreciate the work that Shelley and her team is doing over in the city of Hamilton. And yes, that's exactly it, right? To advance reconciliation in Hamilton is not just a municipal initiative. Indigenous peoples, our rights transcend the purview of the municipality, and so it will take every level of government. It's in, of course, working with the municipality and the provincial government and the federal government. Every urban Indigenous community will face the same challenge because it cannot just be a municipal issue or municipal responsibility. Indigenous peoples have a unique relationship with the federal government, and that cannot be downgraded to the municipality. And that's a part of what the vision calls for, and recognizing, our our community, specifically Hamilton, but our rights are much higher than that, and that requires all levels of the government to contribute to the vision and support it. As individuals, obviously, the way that the political system is set up in Canada, your responsibility is, and your role in it is to first learn the truth yourself, take learning opportunities, participate. There's a number of events in June that will provide great opportunities to connect with Indigenous peoples, Indigenous knowledges. Sign up for those webinars and those workshops. Join us at Soaring Spirits this June 24th and 25th at Battlefield Park. Come and see and celebrate with us. Learn more about the agencies and what the work they're doing. And all of us are a part of a community that has some level of influence, whether that's simply voting in the municipal election, voting for leaders that are aware of and supportive of the needs of the Indigenous community of Hamilton. If you're a part of an organization or institution that maybe has already developed a land acknowledgement, start asking questions about that land acknowledgement. We have this land acknowledgement, but how is this land acknowledgement responding to what the Indigenous community has identified as their priorities? Or maybe your organization or institution doesn't have a land acknowledgement. Start asking questions. Are there ways that we could use an Indigenous supplier for some of the things that we're doing, whether that's an Indigenous caterer, ways to uplift and support the Indigenous community? That's what the vision is calling for. It's not just the city of Hamilton, it's not just the big institutions in Hamilton. It's all of us. Every individual has a role and responsibility in reconciliation.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think we have some comments
Yeah.
from Facebook. I know it's focused around around so we have Dave. Dave is he tunes in every episode. I know we've had only 2 episodes, but Dave is a regular so Da- Dave is saying let me scroll here. So Dave is saying we should focus on human rights, uh, particularly to NDP. Well, I would say all parties, all parties, and
Yeah.
every MP
Everyone.
and every MPP and everyone should understand to understand what the issues are, because again, this is just from experience. Some people show up when it looks good, and then when it doesn't look good, they don't show up again. So we also have to be wary of that. Um, let's move on to um, the reclamation of community. So how how do we embody that in a way that ensures that yes, we are living up to the communal love and the community love that is expected.
Yeah, so that reclamation of community is speaking back to the way that Indigenous families and communities have been, Indigenous kinship has been violently disrupted through forced relocation, mandating that Indigenous communities move from their traditional territories to a place that's more beneficial to the Canadian government, so that the Canadian government can use those resources on the traditional territories. It's the forced attendance at Canada's residential school system. It wasn't. Um, it wasn't an option for many Indigenous children to attend residential schools. They were forcibly removed from their families and communities. Um, and that those repercussions we continue to see today in the millennial scoop, the 60s scoop, where Indigenous children are still disproportionately removed from their family and put into child welfare. And it's redressing that. If we are taking Indigenous children from their family, what can we do in Hamilton to ensure that Indigenous families stay together? And that is investing in social supports to ensure that Indigenous families are thriving and get to stay together in the ways that are appropriate. It's ensuring that Indigenous peoples have the resources to socialize and connect with each other, right? Um, and so, what the vision calls for, what we heard in our community conversations, is that we need investments in Indigenous housing in Hamilton that is Indigenous led and owned. We need investments in Indigenous family supports, income supports that appropriately supports Indigenous families to stay together. And all these social supports, but specifically focusing on the unique needs of Indigenous families and individuals.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
One of the
It,
examples I would share is through our collaboration with the City of Hamilton Housing and Homelessness Division. Um, so, one of Chill's biggest portfolios is addressing Indigenous homelessness in Hamilton, and the City of Hamilton has, through a very intentional partnership that we've nurtured over the years, has invested 20% of the federal funds that they receive to address homelessness in the Indigenous community in ways that the Indigenous community leadership determine the priorities. And that is an act of reconciliation, the spirit and intent of reconciliation, and not only investing in the Indigenous community, but investing in a way that advances the capacity and autonomy of the Indigenous community.
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's a great start, and there needs to be more, more,
Yes, yeah.
more, more of that in on a consistent basis, um, so that it doesn't seem a little haphazard. You mentioned housing. When we talk about housing, what are some of the key issues that you are seeing from the data that you've collected, from the conversations that you've had? Because I know right now, when it comes to housing and houseless folks and rental evictions and all the things that we are seeing in Hamilton, you mentioned that the indigenous community is also disproportionate by issues related to housing.
Yeah, so if we look at the homelessness data that's been collected in Hamilton, specifically through the point in time count in 2022, Chill analyzed that data and reported back to community. Excuse me, 1 second, I gotta sneeze.
It's okay.
I'm so
It's
sorry about.
okay.
I'm sorry about
It
that.
happens. No, it's okay. No, it's okay.
Um, yeah, so when we did the point in time count with the city of Hamilton in 2022, and we looked at the responses, um, over 20% of community members experiencing homelessness identified as Indigenous or having Indigenous ancestry. And when we look at that compared to the general population of Indigenous peoples in Hamilton, which is less than 5%, we can see that Indigenous peoples are disproportionately experiencing homelessness in Hamilton. And a lot of the issues are the same for any community member. The cost of housing has risen to levels that are just simply unaffordable for many families and individuals. but compound that with the historical policies that have impoverished Indigenous peoples, um, adds to that level, as well as anti Indigenous racism. Um, I often share my own personal experience in trying to find housing in Hamilton when I wanted to move to the city in 2011 or 2010. I I struggled to find housing when I was trying to move to the city. I remember so many times I would call up a place and it was available, and then I would go to see the place. The person managing the unit would see me, and suddenly the unit was no longer available. I remember one specific open house on Main Street where it was an open house. There was many of us there to see the unit, to ask questions and to ask for the application. I went up to the person hosting that open house and I asked them for an application. I said, "Thank you for showing this unit. Could I have an application?" And I picked them because I seen them handing out applications to other people. That person looked me up and down and told me in the middle of that open house that the unit was no longer available. These The unaffordability of housing in Hamilton right now is made worse by anti Indigenous racism, which there really isn't. The solutions for myself and for many Indigenous peoples is Indigenous owned and led housing. I eventually was housed by an Indigenous agency in Hamilton, and that, is a critical solution to housing and homelessness issues that Indigenous peoples are experiencing. It's investing in Indigenous owned and operated housing. It's investing in Indigenous led homelessness solutions in the community.
Can you and I know this might be a question that might be obvious, but for might tune in to watch later. What do you mean by anti-indigenous racism?
Yeah, anti Indigenous racism is, um, it's pervasive in a lot of the social structures that all of us experience, right? I'm just thinking personally when I want to celebrate or participate in ceremonies. Um, when I was a student at McMaster, our ceremonies, our times of ceremonies are not recognized in the institution's calendar. There's different ways, it's obvious ways in the ways that people are denied services or are are not being provided the same level of service and supports that other peoples are simply because of their identity as Indigenous peoples.
Hmm. And you know, I personally I think it's important to name it for what it is, right? So there's anti-indigenous racism, anti-black racism,
Yes, yeah,
anti-Asian racism, because they stem from the same place, but their impacts are different on different people,
exactly.
right? So even for and maybe I might be threading controversial areas, but I think even for members of the black community, I think even within our community there are some folks that have anti-indigenous sentiments, right? So to address specifically, I think you were going to say something.
Yeah, I think it's the environment we're in, Kojo, right? It's so easy to pick up these ideas and ideals, maybe unintentionally, but it is important to call it out when we feel safe to do so or to access resources when we're experiencing it. And um, absolutely, calling it for what it is an important part of that response.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and that's why again it's important to uh, um, see the impacts are differently, how it looks,
Yeah,
the history of it, because sometimes too, we do not even know the history. And if you don't know the history, you can't see the impacts as they happen, right? So for someone that sees Canada as a beacon of human rights and hope,
Yeah.
that that is, if you don't know the history before 1867, right? If you don't know the history of the Indian Act, in your mind, you are like, this Canada is the best country ever, right? But the history tells us how we feel the impacts currently and presently. um
Yes.
yeah. So um we are almost close to an hour. um I will definitely make sure that we share the link so that folks can read the 2030 vision. Uh, but then you have some upcoming events. So can you share these upcoming events so that those that are watching can attend, and those that watch, they can also tell their friends and their friends' friends to attend.
Yeah, I definitely want to share about the Soaring Spirit Festival in Powwow happening at Battlefield Park here in Hamilton on June 24th and 25th. It's the weekend after National Indigenous Peoples Day, which is June 21st. Everyone is welcome to come and join us and celebrate. There's dancing, the powwow has dancing, we'll have vendors. It's a great opportunity to come and celebrate with the community. Everyone's welcome.
Mhm. Yes. And any future projects that Chill is working on that community members should be aware of.
Yes, come and visit us. We will have a booth at the powwow. We'll have different engagement opportunities. We are going to share, obviously, the Indigenous community vision. Come and talk to us more about it. And actually, I want to raise that point that Chill is not the only Indigenous agency in Hamilton. There's so many agencies and organizations, Indigenous organizations and agencies in Hamilton. And so it's not about, only asking Chill about what the Indigenous community vision is, but it's reaching out to the appropriate networks, looking internally to see how your operations or your community group can support the vision. Certainly doing the homework yourself and doing the work to know those truths, to know about Canada's residential school system, to know about the past system in Canada, to know about the 60s scoop, the millennial scoop, all these policies that have contributed to what Indigenous peoples experience today. Certainly do that work. But Chill will be at the powwow and the festival, sharing the vision, sharing more about our work. We're also engaging Indigenous community members about other learning opportunities they want to see in Hamilton, and the ways that Chill can support our kinship ties to each other at the agency level and with community as well. So come and visit us at the powwow.
Mhm, mhm. Yes, well, I will definitely be there,
Yes, Kojo.
and I hope and I hope other Hamilton residents attend as well. We will make sure that we promote it at least from Kojo's Corner, and make sure that everyone knows that it's a reciprocal responsibility to be there. So I will get as many people out there as possible. So Victoria, before we end our time together on this second episode of Kojo's Corner, I want to ask you a personal question. Um, there's so much. Oh, hold on. Where Julia is asking, is it all day
It's a
on the
great question,
20 on
Julia.
the
Yep, the 24th and 25th. It's pretty much all day. I think it's between 11 and 5 o'clock, both Saturday and Sunday.
Okay. So see, we already have Julia inquiring. So it
Awesome.
looks like Julia is going to be there, hopefully for both days. If not, either one, 24th or 25th. So we'll definitely see Julia. So why don't we end on this question? Things are there's so much going on in the world right now, and so let's end on, Victoria. What is your vision world as we move forward in this complex we see what's going on, but at the same time we have young people that we are hoping will carry torch. So what are your thoughts for the future?
Wow, that's a huge question, Kojo. Um, you know, Obviously, a future where that's such a big question. There's a lot to think about and to try to include in that response. But I think I'll refer back to the vision that the Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission had in putting this work forward, and that we want to see equity, health and well-being amongst Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples, and that's not going to be easy. We've seen that. The final report from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came out in 2015. They released the calls to action. That is an incredible framework as to how we can advance reconciliation in every facet of life on these lands. And so there's a lot of work to do, but it's necessary for all of us, Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, um, not only for Indigenous peoples to heal, but for all of us to thrive. That renewed relationship between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples that's based on mutual respect and responsibility and shared power, shared resources is necessary for us all to thrive in the future.
Mhm. Thank you, Victoria. And as I've said on this episode, I think the word for me is a reciprocal
Reciprocal.
responsibility. And yes, and I think back to the dish with one spoon, that relationship that says, we have to think about future generations, current generations. And as somebody that was born and raised in Ghana, um those are some of the teachings that my ancestors have fostered. So for me,
Yeah.
I feel that reciprocal kinship and responsibility, right? And so I would hope and I pray and I vision and I aspire that we all have a future where we take our reciprocal responsibility seriously, and we are always there in community to support each other.
Each
So
other.
very
Yeah.
much time with us, and we hope to continue this work. For those of you that haven't read the report, let me put the link in here. Let me see if this is going, because sometimes I let's see. Hold on. Let's see. Yes.
Oh, I see
So
it.
if
Thank
you're
you,
on Facebook,
Kojo.
if yes, if you're on Facebook, if you're on YouTube, to you'll be able to access it. And if not, don't worry. When on YouTube, we will have have the link in there. So we should be good. So once again, thank you. This is the end of episode 2 of Kojo's Corner. We're right at the intersection of people, power, participation, and politics. We will see you next month, July. June. We'll see you June,
June.
last Friday of June at 5 p.m. So tuned. Yes, you can follow us on our Instagram and Kojo's Corner, and we will let you know who our next is and information that we have. So thank you, everyone, and good night. Thank you, Victoria.
Thanks for having me, Kojo.